Civilization, at the time anyway, had the steam engine, again, the pinnacle of technological development. So like Tyler, Morgan saw societies progressing through a unilinear evolutionary scheme. All groups had or will progress through the stages of savagery, barbarism, and eventually become civilized. While today this perspective seems highly ethnocentric, at the time it was a fairly radical proposition. Savages and barbarians are just as much people as civilized individuals are. They're just at a different stage of development. Now, Morgan was a staunch champion of private property in the state, and these were both hallmarks of Morgan's highest stage of human development, civilization. But Morgan was also truly an evolutionist, and he saw that civilization doesn't mark the end of evolutionary change. And in ancient society, he concluded by noting that, quote, "A mere property career is not the final destiny of mankind, if progress is to be the law of the future as it has been of the past." So we have Tyler and we have Morgan, these 19th century evolutionists. But the edifice built up by these two men was to be torn down by the work of one quite remarkable man, Franz Boas, widely considered to be the father of modern American anthropology. Boas, he was born in 1858. He died in 1941. He was born in Minden, in Germany, in Minden, Westphalia in 1858, 2 years after Freud was born, interestingly enough. His family was of the prosperous, liberal, and well-educated German middle class. As a child, he was somewhat sickly, and as is the German custom of that day and even today, his parents would take him to the seashore for cures. And it was during these trips as a young child to the seashore that he decided that one day he would cross the North Sea and go explore the Arctic Circle. A wonderful dream for a small child. But Boas was more intent than most children in their dreams. He would starve himself. He would go on semi-fast, not eating very much, or not eating at all some days, to prepare his body for the rigors of such a journey. In his university studies, and first he studied at Heidelberg, and then he went on to Bonn, and finally studied at the University of Kiel, Boas applied himself to both geography and physics. In his 1881 doctoral dissertation, it was in physics from the University of Kiel, and it was on the color of seawater. And he initially started out, he was very much concerned with the objective measures of changes in the color of seawater, light intensities, the polarization of light when it's reflected against the water, the absorption of light in the water. But as he was doing this research, he discovered that people perceive these colors differently. Where one person might see green, another might see blue, or bluish green, or greenish blue. And he came to see that there's this subjective quality to perception of colors. And so he started. This was the kernel of the line of thought that would eventually lead us to his definition of culture. And here he's working really at the intersection of hard science and subjective understanding. And it gets us back to what anthropology does best, straddling this divide, trying to be a science, but also trying to offer a more humanistic understanding as well. So in 1883, Boas has gone through his state service in Germany, and fulfilling a childhood dream, he convinces the German Arctic Commission to send him off to the North Pole, or not quite the North Pole, actually to Baffin Island, which is today in the far northeast of Canada, but it's within the Arctic Circle. He was to stay there for a year, and he was going to map Baffin Island and also study the relationship between man and his environment. And what better place to study the relationship of man and the environment than such an extreme environmental place? So he goes to Baffin Island, and he starts living with the Eskimo. Now, let me mention here that today we call the Eskimo Inuit. Like the names of many ethnic groups around the world, Eskimo is actually a pejorative. It's a word from a neighboring group, an Algonquian group, and it means dog eater or eater of raw meat. It's not what these people call themselves. They call themselves the Inuit, which means real people. Anyway, so he goes and works among the Inuit, lives and works among the Inuit, and his trip was in many ways a disaster. He arrived late, The winter was exceptionally bad, the hunting was bad, the dogs were dying. He describes these trips where the men would go out and spend 24, 36 hours wandering around in this really deathly cold. Nonetheless, he was able to survey most of Cumberland Sound and Davis Strait, these sections of Baffin Island, and he did so with the aid of the Inuit. They were able, and he was quite amazed by this, they were able to draw incredibly detailed maps of the coastline, which Boas then used as a basis for drawing his own maps. And he was very much amazed by their sophisticated comprehension of geography. Now, during his stay, he immersed himself in Inuit culture, living just as they did. And he was very much struck by their basic humanity and their generosity. He wrote to his fiancée at the time, "I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over those of savages, and I find, the more I see of their customs, that we have no right to look down upon them. Where among our people could you find such true hospitality?" And this experience really sharpened Boas's idea of the basic equality of all peoples. And it wasn't necessarily based on logical reasoning, but on emotion. The kindness and sensitivity these Inuit people had shown him, combined with the behind-the-scenes look that he got of Inuit culture, led him to develop the discipline of anthropology, really, in many ways. "It was with feelings of sorrow and regret," wrote Boas, "that I parted from my Arctic friends. I had seen that they enjoyed life as we do, that nature is also beautiful to them, that feelings of friendship also root in the Eskimo heart, and that the Eskimo is a man just as we are. His feelings, his virtues, and his shortcomings are based on human nature like ours." So after his work on Baffin Island, Boas returned to Germany, and then, fleeing anti-Semitism — of course, anti-Semitism was nothing new to Germany, it didn't arise with the Third Reich — he immigrated to the United States. And in the United States, he founded anthropology programs at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and at Columbia University, and single-handedly produced a generation of students who went out and founded anthropology programs across the country, establishing the discipline. While in the States, while working at the American Museum of Natural History, he initiated an expedition to the northwest coast of North America to study the Northwest Coast Indians. And the Northwest Coast goes from British Columbia up through Alaska. And he worked in particular with a group known as the Kwakiutl. The Kwakiutl are best known for their masks and their totem poles. If you've ever been to the Field Museum in Chicago or the Museum of Natural History in New York City, you can see some of Boas's collections from the Kwakiutl. And he went to the Kwakiutl and he had this notion that he had to do salvage ethnography. The whites are starting to encroach. I have to go in there, Boas thought, and save all of their stories, save all of their legends, record their language, record the grammar and dictionaries, take physical measurements even, and collect all of these artifacts, totem poles and masks and so forth. And this really gets at the heart of Boas's method. Boas stressed that anthropology and our understandings of culture have to be inductive. We don't start out with theory like Tyler and Morgan had and then try and prove or disprove it. He says, no, we have to go and live with the people that we're studying, soak all of this information from daily life up, and develop theories out of that. So Boas argued that cultures are guided by what he called an unreflected logic, and that the job of anthropologists is to go in and record this unreflected logic. Boas argued forcefully against the 19th century evolutionist. He was a German Jewish immigrant. He had a vested interest in arguing against racial determinism. He argued that humans are born with certain capacities, capacity to learn a language, the capacity to learn a culture. But what language, what culture doesn't matter, or rather it's a matter of chance, where one is born, the chance circumstances of birth. One line of thought that Boas is associated with is called today historical particularism. And this was his argument against unilinear evolution. Morgan and Tyler had said that all societies fall along this unilinear chain of development. Boas said, no, each culture has its own history. Each culture has its own past. Different cultures aren't set on a unilinear scheme of evolution, but rather there are multiple lines of evolution and development. and that to understand a culture, we have to look at these bases, their particular circumstances of development. This came to play most vividly in a dispute he had over